Okay, I think we're live now. This is the second part of the presentation, how to write and publish a paper. So we're focusing now on the way and how to publish a paper. So, okay, and how to publish a paper means, you think about quite a few things. So you have to think about what's your motivation of writing a paper. What resources do you have to write and write a paper? Is it time? Do you have patients access? Do you have lab access? Then you have to think about what contents you want to write about, So that's usually the easiest part. But you also should think about what you want to achieve with your paper. So how much preparatory work can you put into this paper? And what types of paper are we going to write? Then we think about the parts of the paper, the authorship, how to submit, resubmit, and how proofreading is later going to work. So we go through these things one by one, and I hope that I can get to the next paper. So first thing is, what's your motivation? So why would you want to write a paper? What do you want to achieve? You want to inform the world about something? Do you want to inform the world about something new? Do you want to make an impact on the group, in science? Do you want to improve just your career? Do you want to move to academic work? Do you go for fame, or do you want to change services? Do you want to help your patients? So the question is, some of these questions might be irrelevant in the way you have to work for this. And writing something for fame is possibly something different than writing for something where you want to improve a local services. So your audience is very important, but that's here about your motivation. So what have you got? Many people don't have everything they want. They don't have the lab. They don't have the team. But sometimes you have to start somewhere. Sometimes you have if you work in psychiatry, that's where I work, you have an interesting case, or you can have an interesting data set. Some of the data sets, I think, which are not grabbed is the NHS clinical data set, or a good example is the clozapine lab data, which come from clozapine clinics all over the country. Or do you already have a completed study and want to write about that? So the question is, what's your interest in research? What's your ambition? And you need to write. So the question is, I would try to focus on what I have and to start there. And later, if you have written something which is important, then later it gives you the opportunity to do something better or more interesting. Many employers would say, oh, that's great. Someone can publish something at least and has gone through the whole of the process. Right, so we discussed motivation, we discussed what's available, what have you got. So the question is, there are different types of resources. You need time. If it's really can be written in a weekend or just a week, it has already been done. So usually you would expect that things which are of any relevance are taking some time. You need some resilience. It's good to have a secretary who can help you with some of the routine work, such as getting the papers and which you need as references. Usually it's quite good to have a supervision and a coach, someone who has been publishing for years, like I did, had to learn it the hard way. I didn't have that much guidance, and this is one of the reasons why I try to help young authors publish in our journal, Global Psychiatry Archives. So a coach is good. Being able to ask a senior colleague would be good. Sometimes, some people make the mistake to ask senior colleagues who have been working in clinical work all their lives and never touched an academic paper. So if you want to write an academic paper, then you need someone who's senior in this role and not just in any role. Okay, so you need access to data, to files, and in most cases, you will need a statistician. So these things are usually much, much easier if you work in a team or in university, but the statistician doesn't have to be a psychiatrist. it needs to be someone who can deal with data and with study hypotheses. So, but the environment of a university or whatever research center is always very helpful. If you want to write systematic reviews, that might not be necessary, but that's much a different approach. Right, the question is, also, where do you work? Is it in a practice, an outpatient clinic, a hospital? And this has an impact on the time you have and the resources. Is it a general service? Then it's more difficult to publish cases. Is it a very special tertiary service? Then case reports might be possible. Do you work in management? Do you work in a university? Then if you work in management, then just try to do something which is related to service development. But if you just whatever, a day-to-day psychiatrist like myself, there's no point writing about management, even if I find something which is interesting. It wouldn't serve me any purpose, or wouldn't serve any purpose to the patients. Right, so what story have you got to tell? So that's a bit, looking at the same thing from a different way. What is interesting in your case? What is special? What is new? Why would someone want to read this? If you publish the 500th whatever case of vomiting on clozapine or side effects of clozapine, that doesn't make any sense. People would want to read something which is new, which is interesting, which hasn't been shown before. Most people would prefer to see something which is something positive. So the question is, what is the story you want to tell? And this is something you can discuss with your colleagues, your neighbors. So what is a story which is interesting? And then why would you want to publish this? So that's another question. And that's your personal question, and we mentioned this before. But the question is also, why does the world must know about it? So what is the relevance to not just to yourself, but to your, whatever, the world of psychiatry or the world of neuroscience? And then you have to ask yourself, if the world must know it, why must you take the effort to write it? You can leave it to others, might take a little bit of longer to wait. But the question is, why is it that you want to make this effort, and what is your expertise on this? Okay. But also think about the reader, but we said this before. So why would someone want to read something if it's something old? Must be a story, must be a new story, must be an interesting story. Right. Preparation to make it a story, whatever you have. Look in the literature, what's available, what's similar, what's comparable. Discuss it with senior researcher, discuss it with senior clinicians, and discuss it with your colleagues. They will know, they might ask you questions, and some of these questions will give you some insight. So what is it what the others want? So usually when you have a paper, you have to give it, send it to a journal, and it will go on the table of an editor. So what does the editor want? The editor wants something his readers want to read. So he wants to promote his journal, wants to publish papers which are interesting, which are exciting, which people like to read. And this is possibly the person who decides on the acceptance or rejection of the paper. So what does reviewers want? They want some clarity in the papers. They don't want to fuss around and just not understanding. They want structure, they want understanding, they want good and clear explanations. And if they send you their reviews and you send the revised versions back, they want to have some explanation how you changed the papers, what did you do with their comments. And this is one of the biggest problems I sometimes see, that the authors do not answer the reviewers, or would say thank you for the reviewers' comments. We made many fancy changes, and that might not be the most helpful of all approaches. Right. So what's the other person is a publisher. He wants to have a journal which works good. He needs good articles. He wants that this journal can be sold, and other authors are happy to pay their article procession fee. So that's more or less the financial interest. So what does readers want? So readers, there are different types of readers. Readers who regularly read your journals, so that subscribers, they don't really exist anymore because most journals are not open access. So you deal more and more with occasional readers. So they want a story which is understandable. Most people don't have a day to read your paper and fight through this. And they don't want to come to your insight. They want you to tell them what the outcome of the study is. That's something I see when I edit and review papers, that some of the authors expect that the readers can make the conclusions. The readers need to be told what to understand from the paper. That's true for occasional readers as well as for regular readers. The other thing is you want to communicate with your co-researchers and say, this is what I found, this is what I'm working at. And you want to tell your co-researchers, if they want to test your papers and check your studies, this is the methods and you use to do that. So the methods must be clear enough that co-researchers can do something about that, and the readers must be, the study must be good enough, or the paper must be good enough that the readers can be convinced about that your outcome or your results are valid and make some sense. And then you have to think yourself about other people, what do they want in the future? You want this paper to be something having some influence in the future. And so think about what other future researchers or followers in your research areas want about that. So they want some guidance, they want something which is simple to understand, and they also need something to know about what is to be done about this study in the future. Okay, so so the different types of papers, that's usually known. They're original papers, papers which, nothing has been published before. You have case reports, we have reviews, some publish short reports. Editorials are usually something which where we don't have data, but where there is an interesting issue to be sorted, where the editor or the researcher on behalf of an editor can say what type of developments are happening in psychiatry, whatever, or in another area at this moment in time, where should be the focus. Something, you find something like COVID. So what is COVID doing with mental health? So at the editorials, you wouldn't find data in that, but people would try to pay attention to COVID and mental health. But later, a couple of years later, that's less relevance than having the data on the outcome and the real original paper. Some journals take rapid communication, which are usually not reviewed as carefully as other papers, but that's sometimes, it depends a little bit on the journal. Letters to the editor sometimes are about comments to previous papers, but they can also present their own data, which usually should be related to other papers which have been recently published in this journal. Right, parts of paper. So we have a cover page, we have abstracts, introduction, material methods, results, discussion, reference, acknowledgements, and declarations of interest. For this, going through properly, I would usually recommend that people would then have a look at the differences within or between journals in the author's instructions. So really, you should read the author's instructions if you don't want to drive an editor completely mad. Right, other parts are references, acknowledgement, and declarations of interest. I think we've said this. Right. Okay, so where do you submit a paper? So you assume you have written draft. Do you write it? Is it something which is, let's say, regional? So if you want to write something, this is what you get very often about a service, let's say a new ADHD service in Falkirk, and you want to say this is the greatest of all services, then you possibly better take a regional or national journal, because possibly other countries won't have the same services, and there's no point making assumptions about other countries, other people. When you write a journal, let's say a paper in the UK, you should also think, what is it that Greek, Chinese, or Japanese or American reader can learn about that? Right, so other journals are so subject specific, they might be just focusing on schizophrenia. Others have different or more general objectives. Then the question is, what are the readership? And you have to look at the impact of the journal. The higher the impact factor of the journal, the higher is the number of papers they usually receive, and hence the number of papers they simply reject. And then you should see what was the reason. Let's say if you want to submit a systematic review on a specific issue, you should look whether this is something the journal is interested. Is there anything, let's say, have they published something about COVID before, or have they just focused on ADHD? There's no point you bring an ADHD review or a systematic review to a journal which never ever has focused on ADHD. So just trying to see that we just, pick something up an author or editor of a journal might be interested in, and maybe also something which hasn't been already written about 15 times in the last 5 issues or so. So it's reasonable to think about something which has been of the interest of the editor, but which hasn't been published too much already in the same journal. Right. So authorship. So who is an author? Usually authors should be involved in most parts of a paper, like drafting a paper, writing a paper, providing information or data. Then, so sponsorship on its own is nothing but or whatever, getting some sponsorship in a way that, they provide whatever they manage to get the whatever the grant through, that might be something where you think that should qualify for an authorship. Provision of samples on its own should be mentioned in the acknowledgement, but if it's just the samples, then it should be part of the authors' teams. So most authors should be involved in most of the different steps, including drafting, writing, providing information, sponsorship, receipt, provision of data, samples, writing up, drafting, and correcting and proofreading. So then, if you submit a paper, just look at the author's instructions for the format and for the forms which you have to accompany. You need the agreement of the co-authors. That's very important, that you don't have an argument with your co-authors. So let's say the sequence of the authors should be agreed by the authors themselves. I would possibly, if a team of authors come to me as an editor and argue about who is the most important author and who should be first, second, or third, I would then just reject the paper simply because I don't want to be involved in any of these discussions. Declarations are important. Look at the author's instruction of the individual journal, but one of the things which are absolutely important, or two of the things which are absolutely important, are ethical approval and informed consent by patients. And then you need to write a letter to the editor telling a little bit why you want to submit the paper. So that's in most cases the most important issue. But check the author's instructions. Right. Let's say you have submitted your paper, you get it back, and you see what the editor has decided. they usually expect you to correct something, put something in right, explain something better, focus a bit more, and then you should resubmit the paper. So read the editor's decision very carefully, look at the reviews, and then decide on what you want to do with this. And your choices can be preparation and response to the editor. I can remember I wrote a paper on transcranial Doppler and mental health, and the reviews were so inappropriate that I wanted to answer. Went straight to the editor, wrote a letter, and they saw my point and were able to publish the paper later. But the most important and most common thing is prepare a response to the reviewers, answer the comments point by point, and usually then transfer your change into the paper and rewrite. Don't be too lazy about that. Usually, if you do it properly, the likelihood of changes, or let's say it that way, the likelihood of acceptance will be much higher if you have done proper changes and taken into account the comments of the reviewers. Right. So usually when you just, the paper will then be processed by the journal after it has been accepted. Then comes, you don't have to do anything about that. If the paper is accepted, sent to the language editor and is then typeset, then you will get the proofreading. And I would usually say, if you do the proofreading thing, it's the last chance from what you can do. There's no correction possible for the next years. There might be problems which might be sorted, but usually it's a very expensive enterprise. You will be blamed for any mistake. So you can't simply say, oh yeah, the language editor has done that. You get the proofread and then you should look at that. And I recently get very sad authors who just assume that their name would be written properly, but they have the you can't this is their responsibility to look at the proof very, very carefully. And I think this is the most underestimated issue in writing papers. Answer the question to the authors. The language editor or the typesetter will have questions to the authors, and you should focus on that. Don't say, oh, you can, don't be general, or you might, we can write this. They want to change, which is word by word, point by point. So have a complete clarity of corrections. The reason being that the printer has no clue what you're talking about. He might not even understand the word psychiatry, or then doesn't understand anything in psychiatry. They typeset what you tell them. And if you make a mistake on that, or you make an assumption of what they should know or shouldn't know, it's very, very difficult for you. Right, what happens in the worst case scenario? A rejection. So the question is, what next? So you have different options. You can accept, you can complain, but the most important point is to try to understand. So what was the reason for the rejection? It could be that you just didn't focus on the right area. You submitted to the wrong journal, and or whatever, the reviewers were not able to understand what you did. Try to read it carefully. Try to understand where they're coming from. Improve it, and then resubmit it. And don't get upset too much about that. Most papers go to 2 or 3 different types of journals before they find them. Most papers have to look around their own right journals to find their place in the right journal. And this is a job authors have to do. Most people would not get their first paper accepted, and if they do, they're very lucky people. Okay, right, so that's my final take-home message. If you're still full of ambition and drive to write and publish a paper after this talk, please let me know. You have the resilience you need. Thanks. And if you are interested, submit papers to Global Psychiatry Archives. And if you're interested to do something for the world of psychiatry, please join the Global Psychiatry Association. Okay, thanks a lot. Right, so now I have to go off live, and I wish you